Then I'm going to try and talk about the, in a sense, potential possibilities and the organizational and general challenges that are facing mainly the European Union, but also, in a sense, relations to NATO and the wider sort of European security architecture. But trying to give my picture instead of how this equation looks like today, and particularly what the last maybe decades changes in both NATO and the EU have meant for the possibilities for the EU member states, and to some extent, of course, also the NATO member states. Although coming from a militarily non-aligned states, I am not going to be the person saying how the NATO states are thinking, but this is more of a general picture of how I see this, the possibilities for the EU mainly today and NATO to carry out some kind of strategy in terms of security and defense policy in other parts of the world. And I will try to be brief and leave lots of time for comments. I'm not always very good at that, so I will have to try and put my watch here somewhere so that I see what's going on. Alright, if I'm saying that I see a lot of changes that have been going on in the last decade or so, it's of course maybe in a sense a bit self-evident that both NATO and the EU have changed. And NATO, of course, has had a very changing role in the last decade. It's not only the fact that NATO has moved from being thought of, at least for most European states, as being a collective defense organization, but now to also being an organization that is carrying out peace support operations in other parts of the world. And that is, of course, in itself a big change, and a widened scope for what NATO is today, basically, generally carrying out. But there's also been another change, and trying to be slightly provocative here, I would actually say that another change in NATO's role is the fact that today I think NATO members are thinking very differently, more differently about the organization than they were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Today, for the United States, it seems that maybe the primary interest that the US today has in NATO is to be able to get the Europeans to become better at providing troops for peace support operations in other parts of the world, while for many European states still, NATO's main purpose is still the collective defense aspects. So for that reason, there are wider types of interests, and they are more diverse today, definitely, the thinking about the organization in itself. There's also, in NATO, still, despite all these changes, there's a very vague political framework and barely no instruments for broad security policy initiatives. The instruments NATO have, of course, are of course still mainly military. So there's not NATO still doesn't have a good political framework to cover broader issues than the military ones. Although, of course, it should be said that one of the many things that have happened has, of course, been NATO's tendency to engage in various types of peace support operations, and there are, depending on how you count, I believe between 2 and 4 NATO operations going on at the moment, depending on where you want to draw the borderline for what the operations, what an operation is. But if we compare that to what's happened to the European Union, there's of course some things that have changed equally in the EU very, very quickly over the last 10 years. And that is of course also for the EU that there has been a widened scope in what the European Union is doing. And for the EU it's even a bigger change, seeing that 10 years ago we had never seen the European Union send out any armed or uniformed and armed personnel in the name of the European Union. And today we have seen quite a few such operations. In the EU, though, I think it's more difficult to say if the interests have become more diverse or not over the last 10 years. I'm actually not so sure about that. A lot of scholars would certainly say that, especially with the last 2 enlargements, that the interests are much wider today and much more difficult to combine and to serve as a base for collective action today from the European Union. But I'm not entirely convinced about that. I think for some specific issues that is certainly true, but I don't think it's necessarily true overall. And I think for a lot of issues, there were quite diverse interests already from the beginning in the European Union, so that many of the newcomers that have come in are placed somewhere in between on that spectrum of interests that was already there. So instead of putting a question mark on that for now at least. What the EU does have, though, and has developed a lot, or is of course a very strong, potentially strong, and strong possibilities to have political framework and various types of instruments for broad security policy initiatives. And in this respect, I think is where the EU differs the most from NATO, because here the default position has of course been that the foreign and security policy is based primarily on broad political discussions, and then the now ESDP and the operations have been sort of added to this as one extra instrument, or one new instrument. And the common foreign policy has of course expanded a lot from the European Union in the last 5 or 10 years. There's no doubt about that. I think no matter how you want to measure it, and even more so if you look back over time, and I'll try to just show you 2 maps in a second. But also, of course, in the last few years, there's been a very quickly expanding number and types of peace support operations actually being undertaken by the EU. So both these organizations have changed a lot, and for EU you could even show it, I think, on a map if you look back a little bit longer in time. And if you take a map of the world in 1980 and the old European political cooperation, as the second pillar was called back then, and look at and plot on the map those issues that throughout this 1 year, it's not a cumulative picture, it's just 1980 only, and just plot on the map those instances throughout the whole year where at that point 9 member states were able to actually do something together. We will see, and those of you who remember your Cold War history will see which issues these are. There's of course the Iran situation, the occupation of the American embassy in Tehran. There's of course the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There are a number of dots on the Middle East situation. There's one on Turkey, there's one on South Africa. And those that are further up are on Moscow, and I think, if I remember correctly, most of them belong to, has to do with the Afghanistan situation, but I think 1 or 2 maybe also on the situation in Poland in 1980. But this was the totality of what the EU's member states could do, or the EC member states at the time. Sorry? 1980.
Thank you.
Did I say 90?
Yes.
Sorry.
No problem.
1980. And why? If you look at the same map in 2003, and it would look the same today, I've kept 2003, of course, because this was the year when the EU was said to not have any foreign policy at all because of the divisions on the Iraq war. But you plot the same dots on the map, and it's looking like this. So it is, in that respect, indeed, it has become so natural for the European states to at least discuss and try to have a common policy. Now, you can, of course, discuss to what extent these are measures that are effective and so on. But it's certainly become fully natural for the EU members to have sort of a global outlook in that respect, and to see security problems not only close by, but also to actually try and deal with security problems further away. And I should say these are only the foreign and security policy measures. This is not the trade and aid policy. It is also not what the EU is doing in various international organizations. So to add to that, of course, and this I think, I hope everyone is familiar with here, is of course the last development since 2003 with the operations. And if you just take a very, very brief look at what's happened since 2003, the EU has started, and in some cases also finished already, 6 operations in the Balkans, 4 a bit further to the east, 2 in Asia, 3 in the Middle East, and at least 8 in Africa. I could count to 9 if I wanted to. And this is just in less than 7 years. And about 15 of these, 14 maybe, are ongoing at the moment. And if we compare that to the United Nations, we can today notice that the EU has basically an equal amount of peace support operations around the world, up and running today, as the United Nations. And that, for an organization that 10 years ago wouldn't have expected to do any of this, is a really, really big change. And also we can compare it again then to NATO, that has somewhere between 2 and 4. Of course, 1 being way bigger than possibly all these together. But still, as a principle, as a growth, it has really been a big, big change for what the European Union is trying to do. And that, of course, in itself then has led to a number of consequences. both at the international level, but also for the European Union and for the member states. And here's where I hope we can come back to then also the possibilities for member states to affect this situation. But to say something about the international, on the international scale, what it has meant to have a completely new actor entering into this world of peace support operation, maybe one of the most interesting things, and one that I am actually not sure that most member states have even thought about, is the fact that the demand for the European Union in these types of activities has increased quite dramatically. It is a problem now for those who work in Brussels, particularly in the PSC, the Political and Security Committee, because basically, if I exaggerate a bit, every morning when they meet in Justus Lipsis, they have either international organizations or other countries there asking for more EU activities, and the EU cannot deliver. So that is an interesting insight in itself, that that the world clearly wanted, or on an average scale, has seen a need for a new actor in this respect. Also, the fact that it has inspired others is, of course, quite interesting, notably the African Union, where much of the whole framework that the EU has set up in terms of foreign and security policy has been copied word by word, basically, by the African Union. It's also given the UN a new partner, a bigger partner than the individual member states would have been. So for the UN, it's a big regional partner that has suddenly emerged in terms of being able to provide peacekeeping personnel, and also, and maybe more of a political science reflection, international historians and international relations scholars would say that if you have new power centers emerge, new big actors in the system, you will always have someone who will try to counter them. There will always be some kind of balancing behavior. Others will start being worried and start getting together themselves. But the EU so far has not generated any of this at all. And I think it's probably depending on the EU's many weaknesses, which I will come back to in a second. But that's for the international scale. Also on the EU level, of course, there's been a number of consequences, some of them I think more interesting than others. And one of them is, of course, that here there's no European Commission who has the same type of influence as it has in other EU areas, meaning that it is only the member states carrying out the policies. It is a strictly intergovernmental cooperation, but still there has been clearly a need for some kind of central actor, and the Council Secretariat has certainly been able already to start to fill that role, more or less outspokenly and more or less visibly, but it is certainly, there has certainly become a new actor even in the EU system that is starting to behave sometimes even as a 28th member state, I think. Also, another interesting consequence that the EU system has seen is that once you started sending out peacekeepers or civilian personnel to certain areas, this has also brought the member states together on a more broad political scale towards the same area. And I know too little about the Middle East to go into it in detail, but I hear a number of people who say that since the two ESDP operations in the Palestinian territories and in the Rafah border crossing point were established in 2005, presumably, that the member states have also had to take bigger political responsibility for what is going on and try to get together to try and compromise more in order to also get the stronger political voice. And I think what is playing out now also outside of Somalia, in the waters outside of Somalia, is a similar situation, where it was easier actually to agree on a naval operation than it was to agree on EU policy towards Somalia. But once the operation is there, countries are also forced to compromise more in terms of getting a broader views on what should be done in Somalia. But also, an interesting thing in itself is, of course, that once these operations particularly has been on the ground, the EU members and the Commission have had to discuss broader, more comprehensive foreign policy issues today than they did before. There has been, they basically Commission and all the Commission state building activities, foreign aid activities, there has been a strong pressure to start and align that more closely and clearly to what is being done then by the Council and with the EU's operations. So if it's not still working very well always, it is still getting a little bit better than it was before, and the EU is becoming better at handling comprehensive foreign and security policy problems. And of course it's led most of all, and notably these days, of course, to treaty revisions and all the changes that are taking place in a couple of days now with a new leadership for EU foreign and security policy and a new organization, which is of course in effect a new EU foreign ministry. It's going to be called the External Action Service, but it is a completely new organization in order to support the new High Representative. So all this, it has all those operations and all these new activities have sort of had a feedback loop into the EU system and affected that as well. But also on a national level, there has been some consequences, and I think here's where maybe I'm of course doing the judgment, having seen it from a Swedish point of view, but I think a lot of these things are quite, also go for other, particularly other small countries. And one is of course that the small countries, once the EU is becoming more and more active in terms of foreign and security policy towards the rest of the world, small states who have small foreign ministries have in a sense been forced to broaden their foreign policy outlook. They've been forced to cover issues that they might have otherwise not really spent so much energy on, but because they are constantly asked to have an opinion in Brussels, you also have to have people covering it in your foreign ministry. And it's putting more pressure, of course, organizational pressure on small foreign ministries in itself, but it's also putting certainly increased pressure on interministerial coordination. And here's where it's quite interesting, I think, to see from a Brussels perspective, where those states who have very good interministerial coordination between justice ministries, foreign ministries, defense ministries, how those countries are often more efficient in pushing their views in Brussels because of the complicated committee and working group structure that has been set up. You will need, the more you are actually coherent in when you speak in different groups, you will also have a better chance of pushing what you're doing. So for that respect, it certainly shows how different ministries within the capitals have had to start try and cooperate better than they did before. But also it's increased the demand for information and intelligence gathering, of course, which is again something that for small states is something that is difficult and costly sometimes, and but where you still, again, you're being required to have views on so many more things in the EU than you would have done otherwise. So it's certainly something that is visible. But also, and this is certainly, I think, true for all member states, but maybe even more so for smaller ones, again, there's been discussions on revisions, and there's been certainly increased pressure on government agencies and their possibilities to actually provide civilian and military personnel. Because it's shown that we all know the difficulties about providing military personnel. That is always being discussed. It's something that's discussed in all countries. But it's turned out, in the case of the EU, where even more of the missions have been of various civilian types, that it is extremely difficult for countries. So specifically on short notice, to come up with, say, even 20 police officers or 15 customs personnel or justice personnel. And because, of course, these people have to be taken straight out of their services in an everyday life in the national setting, in the domestic setting. And it's very difficult for governments to actually decide, to see how to square that circle, in the sense that you promise on the one hand in Brussels that you, for security policy reasons, need to send out EU personnel somewhere else, but then you have to go back and explain to people why you're taking the police officers off the street in your hometown and send them abroad. And I think this is something that most countries are struggling with at the moment, and where there certainly is going to be much more discussions on an EU level on how to do something about it. And still, there's not a lot of good ideas floating about on how to get that situation better. But of course, also from a national perspective, is that once you are in this system, in the EU system, and once you are actually sometimes successful in pushing your national views in this EU machinery, of course it's a small state. It is a fantastic opportunity to actually have 27 of the world's richest and most democratic states to actually speak your views. And for the reason, again, that there is no a strong role for the European Commission, the possibilities for small countries to push things in the EU system are actually quite big if there's a will to do it and if it's handled correctly. So for small states, the EU is really offering a very, very nice possibility to strengthen your voice considerably in international politics, once you know what you want to say and once you know what the strategy should be. And again, I think that is probably the biggest problem for small states, that not in general, smaller states are not very, very good at thinking about this possibility on an EU level. But, of course, so this whole situation with the growing EU and the more active, at least, foreign policy coming out from the EU system has, of course, meant that there's a number of challenges that we now see for the EU and for the EU-NATO relation. And one is, of course, that some or many member states do not have any strong strategic visions for how they would like NATO or for how they would like EU to act. You ask any government in small EU member states if you would write the EU's new strategic concept or something like that, most states would not have a very clear-cut view on how they would want the EU's strategic visions to look like. So, and those who have those views are still not necessarily always in agreement, meaning, of course, that the EU still doesn't have a very good strategic vision at all. There's also, of course, the capability shortfalls, and I already said, I already mentioned that, so I don't have to take that up again. There is a big problem, of course, that still 27 out of the world's richest states have very big problems coming up with substantially enough troop contributions, police contributions, and so on for international missions that are asked for by others and that are, in a political sense, seen by the member states still as being important. So there is certainly a gap going on there. There's also, because of all these operations, when the planning was done to set up the planning structures for the EU's operations, especially on the civilian side, no one had ever assumed 9 years ago, that the EU would carry out this amount of operations at the same time. It is putting a lot of pressure on the EU's capacity to lead and to plan and lead operations. But that is, of course, something that will, to some extent, be discussed, at least now, with the changes in the structure in Brussels, with the new External Action Service. But still, I think there's a lot to be said for how the EU could better actually plan and lead its own operations. There's also another problem, and I think to some extent, and maybe this is something that I'm saying coming from a Swedish context, but there's still way too little knowledge about these changes. If you speak to Swedish parliamentarians today, who are the ones deciding on whether we are sending troops or not to an EU mission, for instance, there are still quite a few of them who have no idea how the EU is taking the decision, that the EU already has other operations and so on. There's still, both in terms of decision makers and in terms of the general public, very little knowledge about how much the EU has changed in the last few years. And I think sometimes that is also a problem, because it makes us not see all the possibilities that have come out of this new system. And then, of course, resources, capabilities doesn't only have to do with the actual troops and equipment, it also has to do with financing. And there's also a big problem today. If you look at the EU's budget, I tried to actually do some kind of calculations the other week, and if I calculated correctly, so take this just for my own attempts, but if you take the whole EU budget and you take the budget line for the common foreign and security policy, that budget line in itself is 0.15% of the EU budget. It is smaller than just the EU's support to tobacco growers, and it is even half. It's only half of what the EU is paying just in organizational support for fruit growers. So not for the growing of the fruit, but just to organize themselves into some kind of unions or organizations. So there's no money whatsoever going into this area, which means, of course, that the operations have to be financed on an ad hoc basis for every situation. And in that situation, of course, it is the trade-off. Then you also have, of course, in every situation, the negotiation that any government has to have with the finance ministries. And we all know what happens when you, as a foreign ministry, come and talk to finance ministry and say, hey, we didn't foresee this, but we want a big EU operation going on and we need extra money, sort of halfway into the budget year. Then it is not an easy thing to do. And that is what's happening every time. And so sometimes these discussions are being stalled or even stopped for financial reasons, because there's still no kind of financial agreement that allows the EU to actually know that it has some kind of funding. And also a problem is that for the EU, but this of course goes equally for NATO and it goes equally for the UN, it goes for all kinds of multilateral operations. And that is that these operations are sometimes not as flexible as you might want them to be. And of course the War Bank Committee phrase that came out maybe 10, 15 years ago is something that is so true also for the EU. And there have been examples where there's been quite traumatic discussions in the EU lately. For instance, on the possible prolongation of 2 weeks of the EU4RDC mission in Congo in 2006, where every party involved, but for the, well, let's say some EU countries, so that I don't point out anyone, but of course the UN and the parties in the Congo wanted them to stay 2 more weeks, and they didn't do that because of completely different reasons. And those kinds of situations, also the EU4 Chad mission had the same kind of traumatic discussions before it was launched on how long troops should stay and so on. And those discussions are certainly not helping the EU, but also it is not a problem that, again, that is unique to the EU. Another problem that is certainly visible, and this also I think is not unique to the EU in any way, but it is maybe more visible for the reason that the EU has carried out more operations in the last few years, and that is that the lessons learned processes after each operation are becoming very political. So you have very nice evaluations going on in the actual operations when they're being carried out, when for the people who run the operations, the extensive work is taking place, lessons learned are being put into the process. But once they have been negotiated a number of rounds, also in the political, on the political level, normally the lessons learned is that the operations worked fine, and that is it. There's very, very rarely that the EU can actually criticize itself and come up with conclusions that things could be better, because it becomes so political every time you need to actually draw the conclusions. And I think that is a problem, because it's meaning that with all these operations, the EU would have had a better opportunity than many others to learn, and it still hasn't learned as much as it could have done for that reason. Also the visibility, maybe to some extent, it is connected to the knowledge about the EU. There's still, at least within the EU, very little visibility for what the EU is doing. And I think sometimes also abroad, it is still other organizations in other countries might be better at showing what they are doing than the EU, because still the EU isn't always shown as much as it could have been. But also in Brussels, a number of course, institutional turf wars going on, especially for the civilian operations. And this is, again, something, of course, that all organizations are dealing with in some respects. But I think the problem in the EU is, in this respect, bigger for the reason that it is a treaty-based turf war, basically. The treaty, and this is not solved also in the new treaty in the EU, doesn't say where to draw the borderline between what the Commission's foreign aid activities are and what the Council's foreign policy responsibilities are. And this is going to go on. And the more the EU is then carrying out complex missions that have a number of aspects to them, the more this problem is being visible. And, of course, then the relations, EU-NATO relations, which I don't know how to put it to be at the same time diplomatic and provocative. I don't know how to do that really. But of course, in a sense, there are, and this does not go for Sweden because we have no strong opinions on NATO in this respect, but in some countries, you certainly hear a number of people nowadays say, well, if the EU is getting better at a lot of this, is it really the case that we need the same NATO or NATO anymore? I'm saying this to be slightly provocative, of course, but it is. I certainly do hear people who start to say that in certain places, and this has, of course, to do with a lot of things. It has to do with nowadays the fact that so many people would want to try and sort out what is the EU-NATO relationship, and again, not a lot of people have any good suggestions yet on how to sort that situation out. Because today, of course, there is a competition in a sense for troop contributions. There's in the sense that if you are a country, if you're one of the 21 countries who are members of both organizations, if you send a lot of troops to one, you may not have that many for the others. And so that is one of the, of course, places where this divide is playing out. But also, evidently, the issue that still is not allowed up officially on the EU table, and that is the fact that the EU is carrying out so many more operations than NATO, but still does not have its own capacity to lead the operations. Of course, the EU is leading the operations by using NATO headquarters, or leading the operations by using national headquarters. So, of course, it leads them, but it doesn't have. There's no EU permanent headquarters, and that is an issue that is also sort of blocked from the agenda at the moment. And all these problems in relations to NATO, of course, is something that is not creating always the most dynamic relationship at the moment on a political level between the two organizations. But also to end this, I would like to say then that if these are a number of the big problems now, and a number of the reasons for why the EU doesn't have a very good sort of overall strategic security policy, where you can say some regions are the most interesting for the EU and so on. So I would like to end on something positive yet, and say that there are, of course, also a number of, some of them entirely new opportunities for the EU that has come out of these growing activities. And one is that it has turned out, and this is, I find as a political scientist really interesting, the EU has often been perceived as more efficient and less corrupt than the UN when it's been out in the world. And if you ask, if you ask military personnel who have been out in both UN missions and in EU missions, in some parts of the world they will say that they were received better when they came with an EU hat than with a UN hat. And so I certainly think there is something to it, and that means something for the European Union when it wants to go out and try to affect the situation outside its own borders. But also, and in other situations, the EU has actually been perceived as more neutral and less self-interested than some big nation states. And this has also played out on a number of ways. There are certainly occasions, again take the Middle East, take the Rafah border crossing point for instance, that was such a situation where it was certainly easier to have the EU play the monitoring role than to have a state do it, or even NATO. And in some cases, and that's where also the Rafah border crossing point is of course a good point, is that the EU has been the only accepted third party. There has been a number of peace negotiations and other types of international negotiations with third-party requirement, but where the EU has been the only suggestion that has been accepted. And that goes for the Action Monitoring Mission, which Matti Ahtisaari got the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the peace deal, of course. Yeah. But part of the peace deal was... Sorry? No? Oh, I thought I said something wrong again. The part of the peace deal was, of course, to have a third-party monitor, and the EU was the only party accepted by both the guerrilla movement and the Indonesian government, and also the same in the Rafah border crossing point, where NATO and the UN were not seen by both of the parties as acceptable as the EU was. And in some areas, and that is also kind of interesting, the EU has probably at least easier to go where NATO can't go. I would still like to think, at least, and this is more of a question mark than something else, and I'm hoping that maybe our Russian participant will say something more about this. But I think in some areas, like in Georgia and in Moldova, for instance, it is still easier to suggest civilian ESDP operation than it would have been to suggest a NATO operation, for reasons of EU-Russia relations and for how Russia are reading this. I might be wrong, so I'm putting a question mark on it, but it's, I certainly think there are areas where the EU has still easier, has a better opportunities to make a difference than NATO would have. And also that the EU has been seen by many as a very welcome addition to the US in the international arena, being another strong diplomatic force. So in that respect, we are sometimes talking, if we're talking about sort of NATO's raison d'etre and NATO's future, we are talking here about not a replacement of NATO in this respect, but a new actor coming in, where maybe on some occasions it is EU and US that are the big two, rather than than the NATO cooperation. And the EU has, of course, shown also it can provide capacities that the UN can't hope to do itself. And of course, the development of the battle group concept has been one of these attempts to provide rapid reaction capacity that the UN can't hope to have itself. We can discuss why we haven't used it yet, but it is at least it was at least an attempt to do that. Also, in some cases, and this was certainly true again in the Congo, for instance, where the UN has operations on the ground, once it has been cooperating with the EU, and once it was reinforced by the EU4RDC mission in 2006, the UN said it got more credibility with the local parties when they negotiated deals for having the EU there, because the UN got more respect out of that situation, which is also kind of an interesting conclusion. And of course, again, and that is the same thing as I said on the nation states, basically, that the European states have, of course, got the biggest say in international politics by being part of the EU in this respect, since the EU has grown into at least giving itself all these possibilities. And then the last word is, of course, the biggest cliche we ever have about the EU today, but it is actually also, there's some truth to it, and that is that the EU in this respect has become a very unique type of actor, because capable to combine and tailor different foreign policy instruments, but also being perceived as not being an international organization and not being a nation state. That is, for the EU today, because it's the only one doing that out in the international system, it is kind of interesting how that has given the EU some extra possibilities and some extra possibilities, although still they are not necessarily exploited enough by the member states themselves. Sorry, now I spoke too long anyway, but thank you.